The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of St. James's Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, adjusted her navy blue coat one final time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold October air, but from the weight of what lay ahead. In just 30 minutes, she and William would step before the world's media to address something no royal couple had ever publicly discussed in such detail. The past 6 months had tested their marriage in ways neither had imagined possible. What started as whispered rumors in the tabloids had grown into a thunderous storm of speculation that threatened to tear apart not just their personal lives, but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. Catherine's private battle with anxiety and depression following their third child's difficult birth had somehow leaked to the press, twisted and sensationalized until the truth became almost unrecognizable. Inside the palace walls, William paced the length of his private study, his usually composed demeanor cracked with visible stress. The red dispatch boxes that typically demanded his attention sat unopened on the mahogany desk. Instead, his focus was entirely on the speech cards in his hands, words he and Catherine had crafted together during countless sleepless nights. They had decided that transparency, rather than the traditional royal silence, was their only path forward. The decision hadn't come easily. Palace advisors had strongly urged them to weather the storm quietly, to let the controversy fade as royal scandals always did. But this felt different. The attacks weren't just on Catherine's character. They questioned her fitness as a mother, her mental stability, and her worthiness to one day be queen. The couple realized that their silence was being interpreted as confirmation of the worst allegations. Catherine's journey through postpartum depression had been a private hell that few understood. The birth of their youngest, Prince Louis, had been complicated, leaving her physically drained and emotionally vulnerable. What should have been a time of joy became shrouded in an inexplicable darkness that she couldn't shake. Simple tasks felt overwhelming. The constant public scrutiny that came with royal life, once manageable, became suffocating. William had watched helplessly as the woman he loved struggled with an invisible enemy. He tried to shield her from the worst of the media attention, but the palace walls couldn't keep out the poisonous whispers that seemed to follow them everywhere. Their private moments became even more precious as the outside world grew increasingly hostile. The breaking point came when a particularly vicious tabloid article suggested that Catherine was an unfit mother who should step back from royal duties permanently. The piece, filled with anonymous sources and twisted half-truths, painted a picture of a woman on the verge of a complete breakdown. That evening, as they tucked their children into bed, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She turned to William, her eyes filled with a determination he hadn't seen in months. "We need to tell our story," she said quietly. "Our real story. Not the version they're selling." William understood immediately. They couldn't control what others said about them, but they could control their own narrative. The weeks that followed were filled with careful planning and soul-searching conversations. They consulted with mental health experts, not just for advice on Catherine's condition, but to understand how their public discussion might impact others struggling with similar challenges. They realized their openness could help destigmatize mental health issues, particularly among new mothers who often suffered in silence. Palace staff worked around the clock to coordinate what would become one of the most personal royal addresses in modern history. Security was heightened, not just for physical protection, but to ensure their words couldn't be leaked or misinterpreted before they had the chance to speak for themselves. As the appointed time approached, Catherine found herself in the same room where she had prepared for her wedding day over a decade earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her. Then, she had been terrified of the scrutiny that came with marrying into the royal family. Now, she was voluntarily stepping into an even brighter spotlight to reclaim her dignity and protect her family's future. William joined her, his presence immediately calming her racing heart. They had faced every challenge of their marriage as a team, and this would be no different. He took her hands in his, and for a moment they stood in perfect silence, drawing strength from each other as they had countless times before. The palace corridors buzzed with nervous energy as staff members made final preparations. Camera crews from around the world had been setting up since dawn, creating a sea of equipment and cables in what was normally a serene courtyard. The global interest was unprecedented. News channels cleared their schedules, and social media platforms prepared for the traffic surge they knew would follow. But for William and Catherine, the massive media presence faded into background noise. Their focus was entirely on the three young faces they had kissed goodbye that morning. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis were too young to fully understand the storm swirling around their family, but old enough to sense the tension. This speech wasn't just about clearing their names. It was about protecting their children's future and ensuring they could grow up proud of their parents' courage. As they made their way toward the grand doors that would lead them to the waiting world, Catherine felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The anxiety that had consumed her for months began to transform into something else entirely. Hope. Perhaps, she thought, their moment of greatest vulnerability would become their greatest strength. The heavy oak doors stood before them, and beyond them, millions of people waited to hear their truth. Palace officials conducted final sound checks and camera adjustments, but William and Catherine were lost in their own world, preparing to share the most intimate details of their struggle with complete strangers. They knew that in just minutes, their lives would change forever. But for the first time in months, they felt ready to face whatever came next, together. The massive wooden doors swung open with a soft creak that seemed to echo around the world. William and Catherine stepped into the courtyard together, their hands briefly touching in a gesture so subtle that only the closest cameras caught it. The autumn air was crisp and still, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Catherine had chosen her outfit carefully, a deep emerald dress that complemented William's navy suit, colors that spoke of stability and hope rather than mourning or defeat. Her hair was pulled back simply, and she wore minimal jewelry except for her wedding ring and the sapphire engagement ring that had once belonged to William's mother. Every detail had been considered, every choice deliberate. The assembled media represented every corner of the globe. Seasoned royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades stood alongside younger journalists whose careers had been built on social media and instant analysis. Camera operators adjusted their lenses, boom microphone technicians found their positions, and photographers prepared for what they knew would be historic shots. William approached the podium first, his jaw set with quiet determination. The man who would one day be king had faced many challenging moments in his public life, but none quite like this. He cleared his throat once, the sound amplified by the microphones and transmitted instantly to viewing audiences worldwide. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Catherine and I have asked you here today because we believe it's time to speak honestly about something that affects not just our family but families everywhere." His eyes found Catherine's in the crowd, and she offered him an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "6 months ago, our family grew with the birth of our son Louis. It should have been a time of pure joy, and in many ways it was. But it was also a time when Catherine faced challenges that millions of women experience, but few feel able to discuss openly." William paused, allowing his words to settle. Around the world, news anchors leaned forward, and social media feeds began lighting up with real-time reactions. Catherine stepped forward then, her movement graceful despite the emotional weight she carried. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, surprising many who had expected to see a broken woman. "I want to talk about something that isn't often discussed in royal circles, or frankly in many circles at all. After Louis was born, I experienced what doctors call postpartum depression. The silence that followed was profound. Royal correspondents exchanged glances, understanding immediately that they were witnessing a moment that would reshape public discourse about mental health. Catherine continued, her honesty cutting through years of royal reserve and formal distance. For months, I felt like I was drowning in plain sight. I had everything anyone could want: a loving husband, beautiful children, a life of privilege and purpose. But I couldn't shake a darkness that seemed to follow me everywhere. Simple tasks felt impossible. Playing with my children, once my greatest joy, became a struggle. I smiled for the cameras because I had to, but inside, I was falling apart. William moved closer to Catherine as she spoke, not close enough to overshadow her words, but near enough that his support was visible. His own emotional journey through Catherine's illness had been largely invisible to the public, but his face now showed traces of the strain he had carried. I blamed myself, Catherine continued. I thought I was weak, that I was failing as a mother, as a wife, as a future queen. The media speculation and criticism only made it worse. Every article questioning my fitness, every anonymous source claiming I was unstable, felt like confirmation of my worst fears about myself. The crowd of journalists remained unusually quiet, many of them recognizing the courage it took to speak so vulnerably in such a public forum. Several women in the audience found themselves wiping away tears, thinking of their own hidden struggles or those of friends and family members who had suffered in silence. William took over then, his love for Catherine evident in every word. I watched the strongest person I know fight a battle that was largely invisible to everyone around us. I felt helpless because I couldn't fix it, couldn't make it better with a hug or a kind word. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is simply be present while someone you care about fights for their healing. He spoke about the sleepless nights, the careful research into treatment options, the way they had to restructure their family life to support Catherine's recovery. He talked about difficult conversations with their eldest children, who knew something was wrong even if they couldn't understand what. We considered staying silent, William admitted. Palace advisors suggested that this would pass, that royal scandals always do. But this isn't a scandal. It's a health issue that affects countless families. Our silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was perpetuating shame around something that should never be shameful. Catherine reclaimed the microphone, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. I want every mother who has felt what I felt to know that they are not alone, and they are not failing. Postpartum depression doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your title, your wealth, or your circumstances. It's a medical condition that requires medical treatment and support, not judgment. She spoke about the therapy sessions, the medication that had helped restore her chemical balance, the support groups where she had met other mothers struggling with similar challenges. For the first time in months, she smiled genuinely, thinking about how far she had traveled from those dark early days. Recovery isn't linear, she explained. There were days when I felt completely myself again, followed by days when the darkness crept back in. But with proper help and unwavering support from William and our families, I found my way back to the light. More importantly, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. William spoke about how the experience had changed him as well, making him a more empathetic person and a better advocate for mental health awareness. He talked about their plans to expand their charitable work in this area, to use their platform to break down the stigma that kept too many people from seeking help. We're not sharing this story to gain sympathy, Catherine clarified. We're sharing it because silence serves no one. Every person struggling with mental health deserves to know that recovery is possible, that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. As their remarks drew to a close, William and Catherine stood side by side, their shoulders almost touching. They had spoken for nearly 20 minutes, longer than most royal addresses, but every word had been necessary. They had opened their hearts to the world, choosing vulnerability over protection, truth over comfort. The questions from journalists that followed were respectful, focused on resources for others who might be struggling and their future advocacy plans. The usual aggressive questioning that characterized royal press events was replaced by something gentler, more human. As they concluded the formal portion of their appearance, William and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They had done something unprecedented, something that would forever change how the royal family engaged with personal struggles. The weight they had carried for months was beginning to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and possibility. As the last question faded away and the formal press conference concluded, William and Catherine remained at the podium for just a moment longer than protocol typically demanded. The world had heard their prepared words, but now something unscripted was about to unfold, something that would become the most remembered moment of an already historic day. Catherine's composure, which had remained steady throughout their emotional revelations, suddenly wavered. The reality of what they had just accomplished hit her all at once. For months, she had carried the burden of shame and secrecy, feeling isolated even in rooms full of people. Now, having spoken their truth to millions, she felt simultaneously exposed and liberated. William noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breathing had changed from deep and controlled to shallow and quick. Without hesitation, he stepped closer to his wife, abandoning the formal distance that royal protocol typically required during public appearances. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a husband recognizing his partner's need for support in a moment of overwhelming emotion. "You were incredible," he whispered, his words barely audible but perfectly captured by the sensitive microphones still recording their every movement. The comment wasn't meant for the cameras or the watching world. It was a private moment of appreciation between husband and wife that happened to occur in the most public of settings. Catherine turned toward William, and for the first time during the entire appearance, tears began to form in her eyes. Not tears of sadness or shame, but tears of relief and gratitude. She had spent so many nights wondering if she would ever feel strong enough to face the world honestly, and now she had done exactly that with William beside her every step of the way. The watching crowd of journalists recognized something special was happening. Camera operators who had been preparing to pack up their equipment instead kept rolling, sensing that this unguarded moment might be even more significant than the formal statements they had just heard. Royal photographers, trained to capture split-second expressions and gestures, focused their lenses on the couple with renewed intensity. William reached out and gently took Catherine's hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that was both protective and proud. It was the kind of touch that spoke of shared trials overcome, of a partnership that had been tested and emerged stronger. For many watching, it was impossible not to think of their own relationships and the quiet moments of support that had carried them through difficult times. "We did it," Catherine said softly, her voice catching slightly on the words. The simple phrase carried the weight of months of struggle, weeks of preparation, and the courage it had taken to be so vulnerable in such a public forum. William's response was equally simple but profound. Together. Around the world, viewing audiences were witnessing something remarkable. Social media platforms exploded with real-time reactions as people shared their own stories of mental health struggles inspired by the royal couple's courage. The hashtag #NotAlone began trending globally within minutes as strangers connected over shared experiences and mutual support. The moment stretched on, neither William nor Catherine seeming to remember that hundreds of people were watching them. Palace staff, who had been preparing to escort them back inside, hesitated, recognizing the importance of allowing this genuine display of emotion and connection to unfold naturally. Catherine's tears began to fall more freely now, but they were accompanied by the first genuine smile she had worn in public for months. It was a smile that spoke of healing, of hope, and of the incredible relief that comes from finally being able to speak your truth without fear or shame. William's own eyes were bright with emotion as he watched his wife reclaim her joy in real time. The press corps, typically aggressive in their pursuit of dramatic shots and revealing moments, found themselves observing with unusual respect. Many of the journalists present were parents themselves, and they recognized the profound vulnerability required to discuss such personal struggles so openly. Some wiped away their own tears, moved by the raw honesty they had witnessed. Security personnel maintained their positions but made no move to hurry the couple inside. Even the palace staff seemed to understand that this moment belonged to William and Catherine, that it was the natural conclusion to their brave decision to speak so openly about their private pain. William lifted their joined hands slightly, a gesture that drew Catherine's attention back to his face. What passed between them in that moment was beyond words, a recognition of how far they had traveled together, how much they had endured, and how their love had not only survived, but been strengthened by their greatest challenge. "Look," William said quietly, nodding toward the crowd of reporters. Catherine followed his gaze and saw something unexpected. Many of the journalists were smiling, not with the satisfied smirk of those who had captured a scandalous moment, but with the warm recognition of those who had witnessed something beautiful and real. For the first time in months, Catherine felt truly seen, not as a royal struggling with her image, not as a mother failing to meet impossible standards, but as a human being who had faced a difficult challenge and emerged with grace and strength. The armor of perfection that royal life typically demanded felt less important than the authentic connection she had just made with millions of people around the world. As they finally turned to leave, walking hand in hand toward the palace doors, the assembled crowd remained unusually quiet. No one shouted questions or called for additional statements. Instead, there was a respectful silence that felt almost reverent, as if everyone present understood they had witnessed something sacred. Inside the palace, staff members who had watched the proceedings on monitors broke into spontaneous applause as William and Catherine entered. Palace advisors who had initially opposed the idea of such a public discussion found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew about royal communication and public service. The couple's 3 children were waiting in the nursery, having been carefully shielded from the morning's events, but aware that something important was happening. George, the eldest, approached his parents with the intuitive sensitivity that children often possess. "Are you okay, Mama?" he asked, studying Catherine's tear-stained but peaceful face. She knelt down to his level, pulling him into a hug that felt different from any she had given in months, warmer, more present, more genuinely joyful. "I'm more than okay, darling," she replied. "I'm exactly where I need to be." As news of their appearance spread around the globe, mental health organizations reported unprecedented spikes in people reaching out for help. The royal couple's decision to share their story had created a ripple effect of healing and hope that would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling. That evening, as William and Catherine tucked their children into bed and settled into the quiet privacy of their own room, they reflected on the day that had changed everything. The weight of secrecy and shame that had burdened them for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and possibility they hadn't felt in years. The world had indeed held its breath as they shared their quiet, heartfelt moment. But what made it truly special wasn't just the courage they had shown. It was the reminder that even in the most public of lives, the most meaningful moments are often the most human ones. In choosing vulnerability over perfection, truth over image, they had not only reclaimed their own story, but had given countless others permission to do the same.